forget. All right, so the session is being recorded. Welcome, guys. Welcome to our second learning unit. Thank you for joining me at this slightly late time of 7:30. I hope you're all good and keeping well and not struggling too much. I haven't had many emails, so I'm assuming that you all have made it through the first learning unit and have started working on the second learning unit, which is on research methods in psychology. So this learning unit on research method, it hasn't been included in previous years, and I'm really glad that now in our new material it's been included because it's a very important module. It's important in its role that it plays in the research that you need to do, in understanding research, conducting your own research in the future when it comes to assignments and exams, and understanding that everything is really based around research and research findings. So it's a really important unit, and I'm glad they've included it. So when you go looking in past papers or looking for past papers, remember that this material has only been introduced this year into the curriculum. So it's not too difficult. It might be a bit scary for some of you, but we don't go into too much depth. It's really just for you to have an understanding of research and how research happens. So let's jump on to the first slide, which is really your module outline. If at any point you've got any questions, you can put them in the chat for me. I'll answer them as we go at the end. Or you can just ask me via email. It's also not a problem, because I know many people don't like to speak during our sessions. So when we look at this module on research and psychology, it's broken down into various themes. It's quite a lot of material. So we'll try and get through as much as we can. So when we look at research and psychology, it firstly deals with psychology as a science, which we'll come to all of this as our collab rolls out this evening. We look at quantitative and qualitative methods of research, which is important to understand those differences between the two approaches to research. We will look at, and it's not scary stuff, we'll look at statistics in research, just understanding why research is analyzed and the different types of statistics that can be used. We'll touch on ethics, which is a very important component of psychological research, is the ethics. And we'll also look at how research is evaluated, because that's also an important component of research, is the evaluation of the finished product. So those are the different themes that we have when we speak about research in psychology. So let's get cracking. So the first thing is that why do we need research in psychology? Remember that psychology is a discipline. It's a scientific discipline. It's not subjective, so it's very much objective. It's about gathering facts and understanding the facts and using the facts to answer questions and then documenting those facts. So we, as in the discipline or the field of psychology, we are committed to addressing questions about behavior, but we do that formally through a process of systematic observation. And as scientists, like psychologists, because remember, psychologists really are scientists. We discussed that in the evolution, that psychology is a science. We have to figure out how to make observations that will ultimately shed light on what we're trying to solve. Those problems that we're trying to solve, we need to figure out how to make observations to really speak about those problems and answer them, and how we actually put those answers forward needs to stand up to scrutiny of other psychologists and other people in the discipline. So we have a big toolkit of research methods that we use, and different kinds of questions and different problems that we're examining call on different strategies for investigation. So we'll look at some of those. So why should you care about research methods? Because understanding these methods about how research takes place will help you as students, and maybe as further psychologists, have an good ability to understand information that you're looking at, because remember, we read a lot of research articles to support our views. We will be writing our own research articles. So all of that helps us understand information, and becoming familiar with this empirical approach, the empirical approach of a science and scientific study, which will help us think critically about claims that people make, specifically regarding behavior. So it's about the scientific observation and the study of behavior ultimately. So being able to think critically is important. It's one of the key skills that we need to develop around being asked to believe or accept something that's given to us, being able to look at the evidence that supports it, to look at other ways evidence could be interpreted. What other evidence might I need to look at when I'm reading this, and what are the most reasonable conclusions that we can draw? So it is a case of being objective about something rather than subjective. And when we think subjectively, there are things that can distort our thinking about something subjectively. We could be very overconfident. We could, and these are called biases, they're distortions in our thinking. That means that the way we think about something can be influenced by things like hindsight, I knew it all along, being overconfident, and looking for things like a confirmation bias to confirm what we're looking for, that's things that support our beliefs rather than instances that don't. So if we don't think we're going to have all of these the tools available to overcome such a cultural bias. Keith, that will actually be when you design your research, when you design your research project or design it, or your whatever research you do, you will build in ways that overcome cultural bias. Things like language, things like being aware of different cultural sensitivities, how questions are asked, whether you're doing it in a way that it might be a specific research in a specific culture, which means that you've got to be informed about that particular culture you're working in, ask appropriate questions. So all of cultural bias is something that we think about all the time when we're working in research, specifically in the design of the research process. So if that helps you answer that question. It shouldn't have a cultural bias, because we should be overcoming that, and otherwise we are excluding people from the study who should be actually included and their responses incorporated into the study. So basically what research does, it allows us to measure things, it allows us to describe things, it allows us to understand things, it allows us to make predictions about things, which is important, and it allows us to look for applications in the work that we're doing. So very much psychology as a science, the goal of psychology is to describe things, explain, predict, and modify. So for example, an example in the pictures there is the more hours you spend on social media, the lower your exam mark will be in your final psychology exam. Okay, so we're looking at relationships between things. We're measuring the amount of time people spend on social media. Does that impact on their final marks in an exam? We're looking at how X affects Y. We need to look at that, and we need to understand it, we need to measure it, we need to describe it, and we need to make predictions about it. So measurement and description, the first goal of psychology is to develop techniques that allow us to measure and describe, explain things clearly and precisely. For example, in studying the effectiveness of muscle relaxation techniques in reducing anxiety, a psychologist must first develop a means of measuring anxiety. So we're looking for things that can measure and describe. And then we need to understand what we're measuring and describing in order to make predictions about what might happen. So we determine what we call a hypothesis, which is a tentative statement about a relationship between two or more variables. X and Y? What is the relationship that X has on Y? Are we able to predict Y if we know X? Does X cause Y? So that's what we do. We set up these hypotheses, and then we measure. We measure using variables that are part of the study. Okay, and the application and control is the profession of psychology attempts to apply research findings to practical problems. So that is why science and psychology is a science, why it's a discipline. It's accurate, it's objective, and it's all based upon research. And we see that with our theorists that we looked at in the evolution of psychology, is the different research experiments and things that they do that underpin the theories that they espouse. So ultimately, psychology as a science is building towards a better understanding of behavior, the same way doctors work towards improving the physical well-being of people through medicine. We're looking towards building a better understanding of behavior, and in order to do that, we construct theories. Okay, and like any theory, like any scientific theory, it should be testable. So a lot of the views of early psychologists, like people like Freud, one of the criticisms levied against it is that their observations were not testable. And that's a very important thing in psychology, is the research needs to be able to be repeated if necessary. So it needs to be repeatable and testable. And when we develop our theory based on our research, is that it's often a circular process. It builds upon different stages. We might have to go back to different stages to revise it until we get it to a point where it's correct. And if you submit something and it's reviewed by peers, they might tell you to go back and change some of your research techniques, change your research design. So it's a very gradual process and subject to revision. And that research methods are a most important part of the social sciences, and that's all the social sciences, as they explain how intellectual functioning can be enriched, because ultimately that's one of our goals as well. It's all of this intellectual knowledge flows into the discipline of psychology. And we do use a scientific method. It is a science. So we use a scientific method, which we will come to now, to make observations, to collect data, to ultimately improve the quality of human lives, because that's what we want to do. And that is why psychology is a science, and how we build the discipline to make people's lives better. Okay, so if you've got any questions, you can pop them into the chat and I will answer them. So as we said, psychology is a science. Therefore, anything in a science has steps of a scientific investigation. This is about how we do our research, the steps that we actually follow. And we will elaborate on some of these concepts as we move through this learning unit. But for now, what you just need to understand is that there is a process to scientific investigation. We see the process with a problem statement. What is the problem? Why am I doing this? We develop a question we need to ask ourselves, or we would need to answer. We develop our hypothesis. We design our research. We collect our data, we analyze our data, and then we report on the results. Those are the steps that are required in scientific investigation. It's very much a stepwise process. You start at the beginning with the problem that you want to solve. So if we take this into a little more detail here, I extracted this little synopsis for you to say that if this is a research paper that was printed, and it says basically adequate healthcare services are not often available in rural and remote areas, and this problem is expected to grow worse and worse in the near future. Telehealth interventions represent a strategy for addressing access to care problems. We examined and compared attitudes towards medical and mental health care delivered via telehealth applications amongst adult, rural, and urban primary care patients. We also examined attitudes towards telehealth applications among a subset of patients with PTSD. Okay, and then it goes on to say both urban and rural patients were receptive to receiving medical and psychiatric services via telehealth. There were some meaningful differences across the variables, but the findings basically support the feasibility of telehealth applications. So that is taken from a research paper, and at the beginning of the research paper, you generally see an abstract, and an abstract is like an executive summary of the research that has been conducted. So I've extracted this because it quite nicely shows you the steps that that person undertook in their research process. So the very first thing that happened was they identified the problem. And the problem sits separate from the rationale. The problem is the big picture statement, okay? And it's generally presented in your introduction. So what is the big picture? The big picture that we are trying to address with this. And the big picture in this is that adequate healthcare services are not often available in rural and remote areas, and this problem is expected to get worse in the near future. Okay, so we haven't narrowed it down yet to what we're going to study and how and why and etc. We're looking at what the big picture problem is that there's a lack of healthcare services that are not often available, and that problem is going to get worse. That is our problem that we're trying to address. Our rationale says to us as researchers, why is this problem to me worthy of investigating it? So my rationale, how can the study of the problem advance knowledge? We're justifying the work that we're going to do. So what is the rationale? Why do I need to address this problem? Telehealth interventions represent a strategy that can be used to address healthcare services. So we're going to focus in on telehealth and saying, here's a strategy that could address the bigger problem. And my rationale is to look at this kind of intervention because possibly at present there are no studies that have been done in this area. So this could be new information. So I need to focus in, and my rationale is, well, the strategy has been presented to resolve the problem, and I believe that I need to now focus in on investigating this. That's my rationale for doing the study. So you can see the difference there between the big picture problem, okay, and coming down more to me as a researcher or a group of researchers, what is my rationale for investigating this problem? Is that there's been a new application and we believe that it could make a difference, and there's maybe no previous research on this, and we can add to the body of knowledge. So in order to do it, in order to do this, to complete your research sort of idea, you need to develop a question, because remember, our research is going to answer a specific question. So we're coming down to something that's more specific. So it's a question that can be answered through the collection of evidence with a succinct and focus on the purpose of the study. So we have telehealth, we have our problem, we've got this new application, so we want to maybe ask the direct question, is telehealth an acceptable method of health provision in rural and urban communities, or mental health service provision? I'm just sort of extracting what I can from this abstract to show you how it all works together. So that's actually your question. You develop a question that you need to gather evidence for in order to answer it. Okay, that is what your research question is. So we're getting from our big picture and we're narrowing it down to a specific research question. So our hypothesis comes from our question. So a hypothesis is a tentative statement about a relationship between two or more variables. A good hypothesis can be tested. So it's an educated, testable prediction about what will happen. And we need to, as researchers, to either prove that as correct or disprove it. Okay, so you have got your question, and it could be a broad question, but you need to narrow it down to what is the relationship between variables that I want to study. So in this instance, it could be the sort of hypothesis that I'm going to say is that community members from urban communities will be more open to non-traditional methods of healthcare provision than members of rural communities. That's my hypothesis. It's written in a way that is now what I want to prove, that hypothesis is true, or I want to prove that it's not true. Another one could be both urban and rural community members will be open to health service provision via telehealth. So that's our hypothesis. That's what we want to test. That hypothesis answers our research question, which then starts to solve the bigger problem. So then we have to design our research. So how are we going to do it? How are we actually going to go about this? It's a step-by-step plan of how we're going to do this research. And we look at it maybe through a lens of qualitative research or quantitative research, which we'll come to later in our collab, but it's about the design. So we're going to do it through a survey, and we're going to do it through a survey with community members who've been identified by local healthcare providers, and they're people who require monthly support service, and we're going to do our research using surveys to explore attitudes of these patients towards the provision of healthcare. That's how we're going to design it. That's our step-by-step sort of design process and our design approach. And once we've got that, so we're going through this process step by step by step by step, we have to go out and now collect our data. So there are many ways of collecting data. It depends on the design of your research. So for example, we're collecting data in this process through possibly the distribution of questionnaires within patient focus groups. So there'll be 100 people who we're going to identify, and healthcare workers are going to go out and complete questionnaires with these community members. So we haven't analyzed the data yet. We're purely talking about the tools that we're going to use as researchers to go and collect that information that we need, that we can then use to prove or disprove our hypothesis, to answer our question, to address the problem. Okay, are you with me? This is the scientific method of conducting research. Once we get all our data, and we've got these reams and reams of questionnaires, so again, it depends on your research design, but in this instant, how do I analyze the data? So now I've got all of these questionnaires with all the information, and I've used questionnaires, so therefore it's like a survey, and I would probably use a statistical procedure if it's qualitative research, or if it's quantitative research, thematic analysis, or the other way around, but there'll be a way to analyze questionnaires. So we're actually going to analyze the data. There are software programs that do it. It can be done manually through calculations, but it's the process by which that data is all brought together, and you can get a set of results from the data. That's the actual analysis process. And the final stage of your reporting, of your research process, is to report the results. So that's where you basically write it up. You write up your research, you look at the results of your research. You discuss your results in terms of other literature that's available. You also, when you discuss your results, you also have to say these were the limitations to the research, because obviously nothing can ever be perfect. All research has limitations, which also need to be brought into the equation. And also you make recommendations. So you can say, I therefore recommend further research on, and you can state what it is. So you report the results that you've got, which are empirical results, that you've collected data, analyzed it, you report it, compare it to other studies, other literature, discuss limitations, and make recommendations. It then goes through a process of peer review, where it's submitted to bodies where peers review it. And once it's been approved by them, then you publish it. Okay. So the report could be your data. That's the final thing could be both urban and rural patients were receptive to receiving medical and psychiatric services via telehealth. The findings support the feasibility of telehealth applications, particularly for rural patients. And then you could say there were limitations. So do you understand the steps in the scientific process? And just understanding how you go from the big picture right the way down to collecting your data, analyzing your data, and reporting on your results. So therefore, you can see that in a scientific approach, there's clarity and precision, and very little tolerance for error. So it's very much objective data and very thorough in terms of its documentation. So all of those theorists that we learn about over time, and everything we read really comes back to the scientific process of producing results and data. So when we look at our approaches to research, there are basically two types of approaches to research. We have qualitative research. So think about qualitative, quality, sort of that kind of approach. Then quantitative, which is when you think about numerical. So measurement. Okay, so difference qualitative and quantitative, and they're two very different approaches to research, and they have two very different applications. So it's important to understand when quantitative research, that kind of approach is used to understand and interpret social interactions. Okay, it's usually things that can't be measured, like experiments. It's very much situated within a person, their experiences in a certain situation. Getting deeper allows us to get deeper into understanding subjectively what people are experiencing. So it's about interpreting social interactions. And generally when we undertake qualitative research, because we get deeper into people and their understanding of certain situations, phenomenon, whatever, we tend to use smaller sample sizes. So that's the group of people we do the research with. Okay, so things like interviews with open-ended questions, field notes, observations, things like that is all focused on qualitative research, understanding social interactions. It's very subjective. Often it's not generalizable to a broader population. Okay, it's something that's happening for a group of people or a specific person. So it's not like we're going to take a whole lot of data, collect it numerically, measure it, analyze it, and then apply it to a broader population. It's very focused on depth, in-depth knowledge. Okay, interviews, focus groups, observing, that kind of stuff. Quantitative research is different. That's where these measurements start to come in and where we start to test hypotheses. We look at cause and effect relationships. Like we said with our X and Y variables, X can then cause Y. And it allows us to make predictions. It's much larger sample sizes, and it's based on numbers that usually involve statistical analysis, and it's very objective. So the two different approaches to research really depend on what the research question is and what the problem is that's trying to be solved. So just understand the difference, and we'll go into this in a little bit more detail, that there are two different approaches to research, and the approach you select very much depends on the problem that you're solving, your rationale, and your research question. Okay, quantitative and qualitative, important to understand that definition. So let's start with the quantitative research. So remember, this is the measurable, this is the numbers, this is the larger group, trying to generalize results to a broader population. So one of the ways that quantitative research can be done is through experimental research. So conducting experiments where things are manipulated or held constant. And the goal is to establish cause and effect. So let's say, for example, we want to look at the effect of caffeine on people's concentration spans for studying. So you could set up an experiment where you had a group of people who received a big dose of caffeine and a group of people who received decaf coffee. And so you wanted to then test their levels of concentration after they had taken this caffeine. So we're conducting an experiment and we're manipulating variables. One group gets no caffeine, one group gets caffeine. One group might get a stronger dose of caffeine, and maybe there's a group who gets a lower dose and a group that gets no caffeine. So we're manipulating these kind of variables to establish cause and effect. So a question could be, we did touch on Skinner, and in the first chapter, the Skinner box and rats and behavior, and does the introduction of rewards increase a particular behavior? It's a manipulated experiment. Does exposure to violent TV images have an impact on the aggression levels of children? It can be a manipulated experiment. So you have different groups. You can have an experimental group who receive the treatment, and you can have a control group who don't receive the treatment. But basically, that's what you're doing. You're doing an experiment and you're manipulating variables. So in an example, well, let's do this first. So let's look at, say we're examining, are test scores impacted by the amount of time sleeping the night before a test? Okay, so you could set up an experiment that you want to see whether hours of sleep are related to test scores. So the more sleep you get, the higher the test scores, or what is the relationship between those variables? So we have different variables. We have the independent variable. That is the variable which is manipulated by the experimenter. Okay, and the dependent variable is the aspect of the behavior that is thought to be affected by that independent variable. So the independent variable in this case, which we can manipulate, is the hours sleep before a test. So we could restrict people's sleeping time. We could make a whole group of people stay awake, or we could make a whole lot of people go to sleep. So that's the independent variable that we can manipulate, and we want to see what is the outcome of that on marks in a final psychology exam. So the final psychology exam, those marks are the, we're trying to okay, I lost my audio for a second. I think it's back. Are we good? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, thanks, Erin. Okay, so that's what experimental research design is. In a study to determine whether how long a student sleeps affects test scores, the independent variable is the length of time spent sleeping, while the dependent variable is the test score. So that is our research design in that particular quantitative approach. So obviously, sometimes when we do research, there are things that impact on our research, that it can't always be precise, and need to be aware of those threats to what can happen in our research. So in your textbook, you'll see it talks about selection bias. So that talks about what our sample group looks like. Maybe we've chosen incorrect people in our sample, because often most of our sample groups are selected randomly, and they're assigned to groups. People, if it's a long research study, people could leave the study. There could be the wrong instrument that's used. There's various things that affect the validity. So we also need to be sure that we can control those things to actually say that that independent variable produces the outcome. So we need to be very conscious of threats to the validity of our experiment. Is the outcome valid? Can we really ensure that there was nothing else affecting the outcome of this experiment? So they are mentioned in your textbook, so just go through those and just make sure you understand them. And there are also threats like the external validity says, can the results that I've produced here, like I have now worked out that the hours of sleep do impact on marks, can that be generalized to a bigger population? Because ultimately that's what quantitative research does. It wants to now say this is a general result that can be applied to a bigger population. So again, there are things that can impact that. Maybe the sample size was too small, so you need to have the right sample size for what you want to work with. And there could be people who are part of other studies, or there could be other things that impact on the outcome. So be conscious of the threats that could happen in your research process. So other research designs that exist within a sort of quantitative approach is what they call a quasi-experimental design. So that means it's not a true experiment. So, you know, I think when you test on animals and things like that, like the behaviorists did, you could then have a very controlled environment. But with humans, and we're working with physical human beings as subjects, sometimes it's not ethical to do some of these true experimental designs. So there could be other variables where we manipulate the independent variable, but there are other factors that can't always be controlled. So an example of this that's given is a comparison of subjective annoyance reactions of learners exposed to aircraft noise around King Shaka Airport. With those learners from relatively quieter environments, students are not randomly allocated to experimental or control groups, and not possible to fully control extraneous variables such as road traffic noise. So there are some variables, especially working with human subjects, that can't be controlled. So if you're aware of those up front, then you can say that I'm doing a quasi-experimental research design because I know there are other factors in the environment that could impact. You try and limit them, but you know they're there. So it's not a true experiment. Descriptive design is basically a snapshot summary of thoughts to determine frequency, and the frequency of those thoughts or feelings can be analyzed. A survey design is a type of descriptive research design, asking large sample questions about perceptions of attitudes and behavior, and we gather data about that, which we analyze statistically. And a correlational design involves the measurement of two or more relevant variables, like we did with X and Y, and to assess the relationship amongst the variables. We'll speak to correlation a little bit later. Okay, so that's a correlational design. So within our and I always have to stop and slow down. Within our quantitative design, there are ways of having different designs of quantitative research, is basically what that tells us. So there are sort of the three designs that I found for you. Like descriptive is a research design. It creates a snapshot of the current state of affairs, advantages and disadvantages of that particular method. So descriptive, the advantages, it provides a relatively complete picture of what's occurring at a given time, and it allows for development of further questions. But the disadvantage of that, it doesn't assess relationships amongst variables. So if you wanted to look at relationships between two things, X and Y, then you know that maybe you need to use a correlational design. So you can work out what is the relationship between number of hours sleep and psychology marks. Then you're looking at a correlational design. You're looking at relationships between things. And an experimental design, which is to assess the causal impact of one or more experimental manipulations on the dependent variable. Okay, so those are sort of the three approaches that are used in quantitative design. So qualitative research, remember this is our other research style, it's really when experiments can't be done, okay, a lot of it. So it allows for collecting data that's non-numeric, okay, it's not numerical data, it's not going to be analyzed statistically. It helps us to explore how decisions are made and to provide us with detailed insight about something. For reaching such conclusions, the data that is collected should be holistic, rich, and nuanced, and findings to emerge through careful analysis. So this is data that can't be put into a statistical process. Okay, if you want to study complex phenomena like the impact of, what was the impact of the recent floods on KZN, on the well-being of people in a certain rural community. You might go and choose a group of people, do some in-depth investigation, one-on-one interviews, open-ended questions. So you're digging deep into a phenomenon that occurred. So it's a phenomenology design is basically about individuals' everyday experience, and the subjective experience is essential. What was this experience like? What does this experience mean? You're collecting data. It's very narrative data. If you had to analyze it, you wouldn't analyze it using statistical methods. You'd analyze it through something called theme analysis, where you would read through it all. Yeah, so you can understand that there's a difference in the kind of information that's collected, who it's collected from, how it's collected, and why it's collected that way. So if we look at data collection methods, if we're looking at the quantitative methods, which is where we're looking to analyze statistical results, etc., we could use tests like personality tests or standardized tests. We can also use questionnaires, but we're gathering numerical data. If we're going qualitative, then we would do things like interviews, where we want to go more in depth to find out more about something, face-to-face, over the telephone, focus group. Interviews can be structured or unstructured, open-ended questions, so you try to draw information out. Observation, documents, important documents, personal documents, public documents, cultural documents can also be used for qualitative data collection. So some studies that you see done are even literature reviews of previous literature. That's qualitative analysis, where they've said, well, let's just see what literature is available, and my paper is going to be exploring my research on the studies that have been done on, and I want to compare and examine different research outputs. So qualitative allows you to use documents, allows you to have one-on-one, go in depth. Okay, so we can collect data directly from the sources, like through surveys and questionnaires, or we can collect data a secondary way through sourcing information from other sources like documents. Okay, and meta-analysis is used to assess previous research studies. That's what we spoke about, to get conclusions. Quantitative methods comprise questionnaires and tests, while qualitative methods consist of interviews, observations, and documents. All right, so those are the different types of collecting data, depending on which research approach you are using. So when it gets down to all of this data, and we've collected it all, and we're talking now about quantitative data, so that's where we're collecting numerical things. The reason now when we analyze data, we also have to describe the data. So we get a whole lot of data coming in. We have to be able to describe it. And describing it is called descriptive statistics, which tells us how this data is distributed across a population. It gives you details like, remember, I think in maths, you did mean, medians, mode. What is the average of the data? What is the range of the data? What is the variance? So it's all of that descriptive statistics that allows us to describe the data that we've got. Inferential statistics is another kind of statistics which helps us make predictions. We're making inferences from our data. So we first describe our data, and once we've got our data described, we can then use it to make inferences. So there's a difference between descriptive statistics and inferential statistics. So descriptive being how do we describe our data, and inferential about using it to explain something. Okay, we're making inferences, reaching conclusions about our data. So this isn't too frightening, but we will just touch on it just so that you understand it. This is very simple statistics. And when we do our research and you get further into your psychology course, you will see there are various processes where you don't even have to do any of the calculations. If you feed your data into certain little software packages or even Excel spreadsheets, it will give you the descriptive statistics that you're looking for. So you don't have to sit with masses of numbers in a calculator. You actually put all your information in, and the description of the statistics can come out the other end. But basically, we have to be able to summarize and describe our data in a meaningful way. Okay, so for example, if I'm a teacher, I've got you as my psychology students, and I'm asked to give a report on your marks, I need to be able to summarize your marks and describe your marks in a meaningful way. So we look at three things. We look at central tendency when we look at descriptive statistics, which we'll come to. We look at the variability, and we look at correlation. When you read research for your assignments, you will see these numbers come into play. So when we look at measures of central tendency, again, so that's about describing data. That is, remember back in maths or maths lit, or whatever you guys did, it's the mean, the median, and the mode. So you've got a span of numbers, and you basically want to say, well, out of my class, what was the average mark? Okay, that is the mean. We all know how to calculate the average. Okay, there's another way to do it, which is the median, where we put all the numbers in numerical order and you take the middle value, or there's the mode, the number that occurs most often. So that is descriptive statistics. We're starting to describe our data in terms of the mean, the average numbers. Okay, one way of describing our statistics. So the average mark in the psychology exam was 68%. I worked it out using the mean. One of the things we also talk about in describing our data is about the spread of the data. So if you have a data set, you have the mean in the middle that you've calculated, but the mean is not always truly representative, because the data might be spread out a lot between the lowest mark and the highest mark. Okay, so although this is your average mark, there's still, my one student got 4%, my top student got 100%, my average is 60%. So the variability in the marks is really important. So we look at the range, which is the difference between the highest and lowest values, which is the spread. So the range of my data, if the top student got 100% and the bottom student got 5%, my range is 95%. So that's quite significant when I'm describing my data. And we also talk about, and I've put a little example on the left, you can see that you don't have to do any of this. Back when I studied psychology, we had to sit with a little book. We didn't even have calculators and work these numbers out. But there are statistical calculators you can use where we talk about the variance and the standard deviation. So the variance is about how those numbers are spread away from the mean. Okay, so those are just words that you need to understand. Variance is calculated as the difference of each value in the data set from the mean, and there's a process that's done to do it. And standard deviation is the square root of variance. Don't panic about this. You don't need to know this now, but what we're doing is trying to give you an idea of how to describe statistics. And when you read the research, you will start to see these numbers and how they appear. And part of it then will be in the final steps, learning to analyze that information. But for now, just understand descriptive statistics, and it's a way of describing data, and eventually we'll get to a point where we will understand completely what those numbers mean for our research that we conduct. Correlation is another thing, and correlation you'll hear quite a lot, and it's probably one of the words you need to get most familiar with. So correlation tells us, it examines for us if there's a relationship between two things, between two or more variables. So our sleep and marks in a test, I've got two variables, and I want to know, is there a relationship between the two variables? Okay, so it can only be used on quantifiable data. It can only be used on things that you can measure and you have a result on. And a correlation means, is there a relationship? That's what we're testing. Okay, and that relationship between those two things can either be positive, or it can be negative, or there can be no relationship at all. Yeah, certainly difficult to hide from math, but at this point you don't need to stress too much about it. Okay, so a positive correlation means that if you measure hours studying and you measure achievement scores, you plot them on a graph where on your y-axis you've got number of hours spent studying, and on your x-axis you've got marks. If the hours sleep increases and the mark increases, so you can see both of those dots are going up to the right, sort of projecting up. It's showing you that as hours sleep increase, so do your marks. There's a positive correlation between those two things. Okay. A negative correlation, so there is a relationship there. You can see there's a relationship. As one increases, the other increases. That's all we're proving. We're proving that there is a relationship. And in this case, it's positive. A negative correlation is something that goes the other way. So let's say, for example, we look at number of cigarettes that someone smokes and life expectancy. So the more someone smokes on the y-axis, okay, the less, or on the x-axis, the less they are, the shorter their lifespan will be. That's negative. So the more I smoke, the earlier I'm going to die. Those two things are negatively related. As one goes up, the other goes down. And if there's no relationship, you'll end up with a random graph like that, and you say there's no relationship between the two things. So what we're trying to do is to say, is there a relationship? Okay, we're not saying X causes Y. We're not saying anything like that. We're just saying there is a relationship. It's not about cause and effect. So the strength of the correlation, we've got these correlations. We've got positive and negative and no correlation. So understanding correlation helps us predict something. That's all it does. It helps us predict. And so you have correlations. Correlation basically a perfect positive correlation where it's a straight line. All those dots are sitting on the straight line is 1. Okay, our correlation goes from 1 to -1. So perfect positive correlation is 1, and a perfect negative correlation is -1. Those are the two ends. Okay, and in the middle, 0 means there's no correlation. So we put all of our data into our statistical package, and it wants to tell us what is the correlation. If the correlation comes out at -0.9, you know there's a high negative correlation. There's a strong relationship between those two things. Okay, so it gives us the power to make predictions about one variable based on the knowledge of another variable. So if your process comes out as 0, and so therefore say you were trying to prove that there is a relationship between the hours slept and the exam mark, and if it comes out 0, okay, you know there's no relationship. If it comes out as +1, you know for sure as your hours sleep increase, so do your marks. If it comes out as a negative correlation, then as your hours sleep decrease, your marks increase, and it's a negative relationship. As one increases, the other decreases. So all you're doing is you're describing the relationship between two things. You're not talking about therefore X causes Y. Okay, that's what a correlation is, and it's probably one of the more fundamental descriptive statistics or inferential statistics that you will use in psychology. So positive correlation we've spoken about. High X scores are associated with high scores on Y, and low scores on X are associated with low scores on Y. Cigarette smoking increases your blood pressure. Okay, reduce cigarettes, reduce blood pressure. Okay, positive, negative, positive correlations. Negative correlation is high scores on X are associated with low scores on Y, and vice versa. Amount of cocaine ingested decreases the number of hours needed for sleep, and the other way around. Those are negative correlations. Okay, so inferential statistics basically says that after we've summarized all of our data, using our descriptive things that we've just learned, it allows us to make predictions and draw conclusions. Does the data support your hypothesis? Okay, my hypothesis is that the number of hours slept increases the mark in the final psychology exam. Does my data prove that? Does it support it? Okay, so then the data that we get is then used to make inferences for a population. So you could say that not the psychology exam, but the overall pass rate of students in a BA. So I can take that result for psychology and I can generalize it to a population of all students, not just my psychology students. So can I now use that to make inferences for the population at large? So an important thing doing that is when you choose your sample or you select your sample, you need to choose people from the right population. So it's no good me doing that and they're not psychology students. So I need to make sure that I choose and eliminate chance from the results and make sure that my data can be generalized to the whole population. And we end up with what we call a statistical significance. And that does tell us that due to observed, the chance is low, tells us the fact that the observed findings are due to chance is low. So we need to rule out that this is not due to chance, that it's an actual experiment and the results of our experiment are accurate. So you determine the statistical significance, and it will sort of work between very low is defined as less than 5 chances and 10. This tells us there's a 5% chance that our hypothesis was wrong. Okay, so it's important to understand that level of significance. And when you do your research and when you get further into your research, you'll see people talking about the level of significance. It's basically eliminating chance from your results. Okay, so descriptive statistics and inferential statistics. It's gone to ethics and heading towards the end, so we're not too far off. So ethics are really, really important in psychological research, and ethical issues have to be resolved prior to a research study being done. And often, well, in most cases, you're regulated by a code of ethics and you have to submit to a committee who actually approve your research, because they have to ensure that there's no ethical violations in your research. Because remember, we're studying people, and even if we were studying animals, they also need to be treated ethically. So there are ethical guidelines that need to follow. And the ethical guidelines follow things like, and it's in your textbook, so have a look through them. They're very self-explanatory. Voluntary participation. We can't coerce people to participate in our study. They have to be able to participate voluntarily. Okay. So the rights of the participants are really, really important. They might be contributing to science, but at the end of the day, people have rights and they have to participate voluntarily. They have to be informed of, you have to have informed consent, so preferably in writing, and that you give them that informed consent and they know that they can withdraw from the study at any time. So they know exactly what they are consenting to. There also has to be an element of confidentiality. It's like anything. It's like psychologist-patient confidentiality, is that their names can't be published in research unless they've given permission for that to happen. But confidentiality is really important. They need to be protected from all the risks and told explicitly of any risks. And again, there can't be any deception. Okay, so you can't deceive people. You can't say, well, please participate in a study on something, and you actually test something else. You can't deceive people about what they're participating in. At the end of the study, you should debrief them as well, which means you call them together, you tell them exactly about the study, and you can give them the results. So those are the ethical guidelines, and it's really important you understand those as a psychologist, because every piece of research has to be ethically conducted and you're bound by a code of ethics. So make sure you read that section carefully in your textbook, which goes into a little bit more detail about each of those ethical guidelines that you need to understand. I think in last year's exam, we had a question on these ethical guidelines. So it is an important part of what we do. And the final part of this is being able to evaluate the research. So we can't always conclude that the research that has been done or that we've read or that we want to present is error-free. Okay, it's important to be able to evaluate it. And ultimately, evaluating research says to us, can the study be replicated and the same results achieved? Because that's what should happen, is that if you do research and if you do it properly and if you report on it and if you do everything sort of by the book, can that be replicated? And if it can be replicated, then it's pretty much error-free. If it's replicated and the results are completely different, then you know that there's error in the initial research process. So there are biases in research. There are things that can go wrong. We could choose people in our samples who are not representative of the population that we want to generalize the results to. We might have an under or over representation of certain people. We can have errors in the measurement. So when the data is actually being collected, there are errors in that. There's errors in the tools that we use. There's errors with the experimenter themselves, because often as researchers, you might be biased about seeing what you want to see or interpreting results as to how you want to see them interpreted. And there could be insensitivity in the instrument, so it might not actually measure what it's supposed to measure. And again, when you are doing qualitative research, there could be distortions in self-report. So if you're interviewing someone about something, you know that possibly that participant is not giving you the answer that you're needing. Okay, so distortions in self-report are also an issue. So that's about evaluating research. So guys, that is research in psychology. It's not that difficult. I think in your assignment, there are some questions on this research. And tomorrow night at 6 o'clock, we will have a national support session where I will go through with you your assignment so that I'm sure you guys understand it. And you'll see that some of your assignment, we've hopefully answered, or I've assisted you with some of that assignment tonight. So yeah, it's not that challenging. We'll get together tomorrow night at 6 o'clock. I did send out the link for the national support session, because then you're a week away from submitting your first assignment, and then we would have covered, or we should have covered, all the material now. Yeah, so any questions, you're welcome to ask me now, or you can email me. But we will chat tomorrow night at 6 o'clock for a national support session, which is not too long at all, but it's really just to make sure you're comfortable with what the assignment is asking you to do. Okay, any questions? No? Okay, well, I'm going to stop the recording now.